On the night of the gala, the valet didn't even open my door. He looked at my old jacket, then at the line of luxury cars behind me, and simply turned away. And that's when I heard someone in line whisper, "Who let that man in?" That's when it started. Not with a handshake, not with a welcome, but with a dismissal dressed as silence. I shouldn't have come. Not because I didn't belong, but because I knew they had already decided I didn't. The invitation had arrived a month earlier. Thick envelope, elegant calligraphy. Hosted by Amelia Wexley, my niece. A charity gala in her name. For education, for the future. Black tie required. A printed line that carried more judgment than formality. I wasn't on the list of speakers. Not on the list of honorees. Not even among the VIPs. Just listed, once, as a legacy supporter. No title. No bio. No mention that I had funded more than half the foundation's first 5 years. No mention that I started the foundation. Still I came, quietly alone, not for glory, but to see what had become of something I helped build with my bare hands, with late nights and silent sacrifices. My jacket, brown wool with fraying at the cuffs, had seen more history than most of the people in that ballroom, and it had warmth, the kind that didn't need tailoring or a price tag to matter. But from the moment I stepped through the glass doors, I wasn't a guest. I was a shadow they hadn't expected, one they hoped would fade into the corner before the cameras rolled. My niece saw me near the check-in table. She hesitated, just for a breath, before forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Uncle," she said, brushing a quick air kiss near my cheek. "You came." She looked down at my jacket, trying not to wrinkle her nose. "I wish someone had told you. It's formal. But it's okay, I guess. You'll find your seat in the back." She moved on before I could answer, before I could remind her that I wasn't just a guest, that without me, there wouldn't be a gala, that the first student this foundation ever helped still sends me postcards. But I said nothing, just nodded and followed the usher past the velvet ropes, past the photographers, past the tables marked with gold leaf names, until I found mine, small, near the kitchen entrance, a seat for the invisible. And as the orchestra played and the lights dimmed, I sat there in my old jacket, the one my late wife gave me on our 25th anniversary, and watched them toast to a legacy they had rewritten without me. I wasn't hurt by the laughter, not yet, but I knew it was coming, and this time I would not stay silent. Friends, let me take a quick pause. If you're still here with me, thank you. Please take a moment to write in the comments, where are you listening from? And have you ever experienced something like this in your life? A moment when you were overlooked, dismissed, judged by the surface? If this story speaks to you, consider subscribing and sharing it with someone who needs to hear it. It's the best way to support our channel and help us keep telling stories that matter. All right, let's continue. When I stepped deeper into the ballroom, it felt like the air changed, like the warmth drained out of the lights, even though they burned just as bright. It wasn't the kind of silence that welcomes you. It was the kind that measures you, the kind that slices. Eyes turned, heads tilted, but not in recognition, not in warmth. They didn't see a man who'd built the very foundation beneath their feet. They saw a relic, a misplaced figure in a room polished with wealth and pretense. Laughter hovered in the corners, soft, muffled behind thin glasses of champagne. The kind of laughter that pretends it isn't about you, but always is. I walked slowly, not because I was unsure of where I was going, but because every step reminded me I was somewhere I was no longer invited to belong. The jacket, my wife's last gift to me, suddenly felt heavier, not in weight, but in memory. It had once been wrapped around her shoulders when she got cold. She used to say it smelled like safety, like home. Now it smelled like mockery to them, like something unfashionable, unfit, and yet not one of them knew what that jacket had carried, what meetings it had been worn to, what hands it had shaken, what contracts it had signed, what shelters it had stood in. Not one of them knew that when the first bricks were laid for this very foundation, I was the one hauling them at dawn, not just with money, but with belief. Belief in a future worth building, even if no one would remember the hands that laid it. But now they remembered silk and satin. Now they worshipped clean lines, designer cuts, and Instagram captions. Not the quiet grit of the man who sat in the back. A waiter passed by and offered me a glass, but the tray leaned just slightly away from me, as if my jacket might stain the crystal. In the corner of the room, 2 young women whispered and looked in my direction. They weren't cruel. They didn't have to be. Their eyes said enough. Why is he even here? I lowered my gaze and sat down at my assigned seat. No nameplate. Just a folded napkin and a candle that flickered like it, too, didn't belong on my table. And that's when it hit me. Not the shame, but the truth. They had taken something I built with heart and turned it into something I didn't recognize. A show, a parade, a celebration of themselves. Not the cause. Not the people we were supposed to be helping. And I was now just an unwanted reminder. A mirror they didn't want to look into. Because in me, they'd see how it all began. With calloused hands, honest intentions, and a jacket that never needed to impress. But oh, if they only knew who they were laughing at. She approached like someone trying to fix a mess before the photographers noticed. Quick steps, shallow smile, polished elegance wrapped in anxiety. My niece, Amelia, the face of the gala, the visionary behind the charity, and the same little girl I once carried on my shoulders through muddy fields to get to school. But tonight, she moved like she'd never needed anyone's help, as if her success had always been inevitable. Born, not earned. Her eyes scanned me from head to toe, not to greet, to assess. Like I was a mistake she hadn't accounted for in the seating chart. She reached out, gently tugging at my sleeve like she used to do as a child. Only this time, not to play, but to correct, to conceal. "Uncle," she said softly with that rehearsed warmth that doesn't reach the soul. "You could have at least tried, rented something." She didn't even look at my face when she said it. Her gaze clung to the jacket like it embarrassed her, like it was a stain on her event. I looked at her, not with anger, not even hurt, but with something far heavier. Recognition. I recognized what the room had done to her, how status had silenced her memory, how appearances had replaced values, how the mission we started, to give underprivileged kids access to education, had been repackaged into a designer dinner with donor tables and camera-ready speeches. I wanted to tell her that this jacket had been with me when we signed the first grant, that it had kept me warm the night her mother called me crying because Amelia had been rejected from her first college choice, that this same jacket held the letter I wrote, the one that secured her a scholarship through my own fund, disguised under another name so she wouldn't feel ashamed. I wanted to say all that, but I didn't, because I knew she wouldn't hear it. Not tonight, not while she was still performing for the room. So instead, I just looked down at the fabric, ran my fingers over the worn cuff, and whispered, not to her, not even to myself, but to the memory of what we used to be. This jacket built this building, but she didn't hear me. Or maybe she did, and that was worse, because she didn't stop, didn't pause. Just gave a quick, tight nod and turned to greet another guest in velvet and pearls. Someone whose name hadn't even been on the earliest donor list. She disappeared into the lights and applause, and I was left standing there, not rejected, just forgotten. And sometimes that's worse than hatred, because hatred remembers, but forgetfulness erases. Yet something inside me stayed calm, still, because I knew what they didn't. I knew what was coming, and I knew this jacket story wasn't over, not by a long shot. The chair they gave me was near the exit, not by accident, half shadowed by a column facing slightly away from the stage. A perfect place for someone they didn't want seen, but couldn't quite keep out. A corner reserved for ghosts. On the table lay a glossy program. Gold lettering, heavy cardstock. It listed every speaker, every sponsor, every patron who had made this night possible. I opened it slowly. Line by line, my eyes traced names. Lawyers, bankers, tech heirs. Some I'd never met. Some I knew had only joined the cause after we had already succeeded. One of them had once laughed in my face when I pitched the foundation's first idea. Now he was Platinum Legacy Partner. But my name? Nowhere. I turned the page again, checked the back. The acknowledgments, the dedications. Nothing. Not even a mention. Not a line. Not a syllable. And yet, above this very ballroom, held up by beams and steel I paid for under chandeliers I approved, beneath a roof that I personally funded when donations ran dry, they were now hosting a celebration that pretended I had never existed. And still I sat there, not out of pride, but because I needed to see it with my own eyes, needed to witness what happens when legacy is rewritten by those who arrived after the work was already done. I remembered the day the foundation was born, not with a gala, but with a leaking ceiling, broken printers, and one volunteer. That first week we couldn't afford staff, so I swept the floors myself. I'd bring sandwiches for the interns, sometimes even covered their bus fare. Back then, we didn't care about names printed on brochures. We cared about kids. Scared, brilliant kids who just needed someone to believe in them. Now those same kids were nowhere in this room, replaced by flashing cameras and hollow speeches, replaced by people clapping for themselves. I folded the program gently and placed it down. It didn't sting like it once would have, because I realized then, the building might carry their names tonight, but the memories, they carried mine. And even if they never wrote it down, the roof knew who paid for it. The walls remembered who stood by them. The foundation, the real one, couldn't forget. Because I was the foundation, and when a storm comes, brochures blow away, but foundations stay. The music softened, and the stage lights warmed to gold. All conversation dimmed as Amelia took the stage. Her dress shimmered, her voice projected with the practiced charm of someone who had rehearsed this night, in her dreams, 1,000 times. She welcomed everyone, thanked the sponsors, complimented the chefs. She even gave a moment of silence, not for anyone in the room, but for a hedge fund manager who had passed away 2 years ago and left a large sum in his will. She called him a man of vision, and then the toast began. Crystal clinked against crystal. Laughter rose and fell on cue, and with every name lifted into the air, I felt a little more of the truth sink beneath the surface. They thanked the designers of the venue, the PR team, the social media interns. They even acknowledged the security team at the door, but not the man who'd once mortgaged his own home to keep this very building from shutting down in its first year. No one mentioned the nights I stayed up fixing the leaking roof, alone, with a flashlight when the board walked away. No one recalled how I negotiated, begged even, to get reduced construction rates just to finish the East Wing. And certainly no one said what we both knew was true. Without me, none of them would be standing there. I wasn't asking for applause. I didn't need a standing ovation. But this collective amnesia, this revisionist theater, it was no longer forgetfulness. It was erasure. The words visionary and leader were tossed around so easily. They used them like party favors, attaching them to anyone with a title, a donation, or a social following. But what about those of us who gave before there was anything to give to? Before the lights? Before the press? A man raised his glass beside me, someone I'd once mentored. He toasted Amelia's entrepreneurial courage. I remembered when she cried in my living room, doubting if she could even finish her business degree. I paid for her last semester, anonymously. She never asked who, never said thank you. Now she was a trailblazer. Another woman called tonight a monument to generosity. And yet generosity, it seemed, only counted when it came with a press release and an Instagram filter. Not when it came quietly in the form of sacrifices no one ever saw, like selling my watch to cover the first payroll, or giving away the rights to my name on the foundation's documents, because someone once told me it didn't sound modern enough. And so I sat there still, hands folded, heart steady. But something had shifted inside me, not anger, something colder, clearer, because I realized that when people toast to themselves long enough, they forget where the wine came from, who planted the vineyard, who watered it when no one else showed up, and eventually, those people learn what happens. When the man they forgot finally stopped staying quiet, the microphone crackled to life, and a young donor stepped forward with that rehearsed bravado that only comes from never having to fear losing anything. He cleared his throat, and with a smirk hidden in polite expression declared that the spirit of charity is dressing like you belong. Laughter rippled through the room like a wave, sharp, mocking, gleeful. In an instant, every gaze snapped to me, to the brown wool of my jacket, each worn thread bright under the chandelier's glare. In that moment, something inside me tightened, like cold steel coiling in the chest. Because this wasn't just a joke. It was the culmination of every whispered comment, every polite dismissal, every erasure of my name from their polished pages. The plate of hors d'oeuvres trembled in the young man's hand as the crowd's eyes danced between amusement and cruelty. Champagne pursed their lips, smiles froze on expensive faces. I felt the weight of my memories settle around me. The first brick I laid in the foundation we'd built together, the nights I'd spent patching holes in the roof, the scholarships I'd funded in secret so that One day these very halls would know the promise of education. None of that mattered now. All that mattered was the jacket, an emblem of my labor, my love, my silent sacrifice, turned into a punchline. For a heartbeat, I considered silence, but silence was their weapon. So I stood and let my quiet gaze sweep across the room, holding each of their eyes in turn. The laughter died on their lips as they met the calm storm in mine. In the hush that followed, they realized this wasn't a forgotten old man. This was the man whose hands built the stage on which they all now stood, and whose voice, finally unleashed, would no longer be ignored. I slipped away from the glare of spotlights and the echo of stunned silence, finding refuge in a narrow corridor where the marble floor felt colder and the air tasted like time suspended. My fingers traced the seams of the jacket, each stitch a testament to moments no one else could see. The day I closed a deal that saved the foundation's future, my hands trembling from exhaustion and hope. The thunderstorm night when I patched a leaky ceiling beneath these very halls, water dripping into my collar as thunder shook the beams. The quiet morning in that same jacket when I held my newborn daughter's hand for the first time, promising her a world of opportunity I still believed in. The hush of a funeral home where I wore its faded wool to bury my wife, clutching her handkerchief in the pocket I'd sewn myself. No one knew any of this. No one cared. To them, it was just an outdated coat, an accessory unworthy of the gala's glamour. Yet in every frayed thread lived our story. Love and loss, sacrifice and triumph. Every mile I'd walked to build something lasting for others. My heart ached as I remembered her smile when she presented it to me on our anniversary, saying it would carry us wherever we needed to go. And now it carried me through a moment of reckoning. Proof that true worth isn't measured by labels or lapels, but by the memories woven into every fiber, the unseen labor that gives shape to legacies. I closed my eyes, inhaled its familiar scent of wool and lavender, and felt a quiet resolve rise within me. They might have mocked my jacket, but they could never unravel the truth stitched into its heart. He appeared at my side as I lingered by the banquet table, a tray of half-empty glasses forgotten in his hand. Barely more than a boy, his eyes locked on mine with a tremor of hope. "Sir," he said, voice low and urgent, "is your name Mr. R. Wexley?" I nodded, surprised by his steady tone. He swallowed, glanced at the polished marble underfoot, then continued, not lowering his gaze. "I work at the shelter your company built." My breath caught. The shelter, once just a dream on paper, then a half-finished project when donations dried up, stood on the edge of town, warmth against winter nights and fear. I remembered the day we cut that ribbon, the children pressing their faces against frosted windows, eyes wide with wonder as they stepped inside for the first time. He told me how his mother had lost everything when the factory closed, how she'd scrambled to feed him and his sister, how he'd slept hungry some nights. And then, because of that shelter, she found clean uniforms, hot meals, and eventually a job through the Foundation's employment program. "You helped my mom get her first job. You changed my life." He paused, as if afraid he'd said too much. But he looked at me as though he'd just revealed a secret we shared alone. In that moment, I felt every lonely mile I'd walked, every sleepless night repairing budget shortfalls, every penny I'd given when no one was watching swirl into something far greater than any gala could capture. Around us, the ballroom's opulence blurred into insignificance. The chandeliers, the silk gowns, the whispered laughter, all faded under the weight of his words. Here was the reason I'd worn this old jacket, braved the judgment, endured the erasure. Not for praise, but for that single spark of human dignity it had helped ignite. I reached out and steadied his shoulder, feeling the strength in his grip, the promise of his future. No brochure had his name printed in gold. No toast had lifted his story to the crowd. Yet here he was, voice clear and unwavering, giving me the recognition I'd never sought, but now understood I deserved. And as I looked back toward the ballroom, I no longer saw a room full of critics. I saw walls whose foundations I'd poured, floors I'd paid to pave, and lives I'd fought to uplift. The jacket, threadbare and stained, felt suddenly like armor, woven with purpose. He stepped away, head held high, leaving me with a warmth that chased away every lingering echo of mockery. The joke was over, the silence was broken, and in that moment I realized that true celebration didn't need gilded programs or public acclaim. It needed only one brave voice to speak the truth, and one heart willing to listen. They herded us back into the glittering hall as if nothing had changed. The orchestra rose again, strings echoing in the domed ceiling, but the notes felt hollow. A man in a tuxedo strode to the center stage and lifted a gavel. "Our next item," he announced, "is the live auction for the future of education." A hush fell. I watched as paddles shot up in the air, each one a silent testament to wealth flaunted as virtue. The hammer fell. Millions pledged for named chairs and library wings. "All proceeds go to develop new scholarship programs," the auctioneer declared. Applause rippled through the room, padded feet stamping pride into the carpet. My heart tightened at the irony, because every scholarship they now sold by candlelight, every future they packaged and paraded, 5 of those had already been given quietly under the radar. 5 bright-eyed kids in this very crowd, walking these same polished floors tonight, lived on dreams I had funded long before a single paddle went up. No program announced their names beneath a spotlight, no benefactor's name etched on a plaque. They didn't need the show because they were already living proof that generosity could transform a life without shouts or fanfare. I imagined each of them sitting at home, studying under borrowed lamps, hearts beating with the promise of a chance. The boy from the shelter, now enrolled in his first semester of engineering. The girl whose family folded when illness struck, now training to become a teacher herself. The siblings whose laughter once echoed down empty hallways, now planning their futures on campus tour brochures. They sat here somewhere among us, faceless among the glitterati, their hopes auctioned off again tonight like luxury items. And the thought stung deeper than any public slight, because true charity didn't ask for recognition. It didn't depend on cameras or flattery. It was an act of faith, a quiet promise whispered in the night. I looked at my jacket's worn lapel and felt its weight anchor me. No applause, no name tags, just the echo of lives changed silently before the show began. And in that quiet undercurrent, I found a power stronger than any gavel's strike. A power that no auction could ever buy or sell. The room hushed again, but this time the silence carried gravity. The mayor, a man in a perfectly pressed suit, lips curved into a practiced smile, rose from his seat as though drawn by some unseen force. He cleared his throat once, and in that single breath, the air shifted. "I'd like to thank our honorary founder," he began, voice steady yet warm. No programs had ever listed him in that role. No invitation had ever called him that. But tonight, the words landed like thunder. He unfolded a yellowing file from his briefcase and held it aloft. The edges were frayed, corners bent, documents that no gala committee had thought to showcase. As he flipped it open, I saw the original charter of the foundation, my signature in ink that had faded over years of meetings and margins scribbled with my notes. He spoke slowly, reading passages that traced the foundation's birth, the vision I'd laid out in handwritten paragraphs, the initial board roster I'd assembled in my study, the personal loan I'd offered to cover operating expenses when donations stalled. With each sentence, faces around me shifted from pride to confusion, from smugness to dawning awe. He paused and met my eyes, holding my gaze longer than any photograph or speech ever had. Then he spoke my name, Roderick Wexley, clear and unadorned, yet charged with decades of sacrifice. The effect was instantaneous. Chairs scraped back, guests rose, breath caught in collective chests. They realized this was the man who had quietly built every brick they now stood upon. In that raw moment of recognition, I felt the weight of every overlooked effort. That first rainy morning when I worked the boots off my feet to clear debris. Every midnight, oil-burned drafting grant proposals. Every whispered reassurance to frightened parents that education could change their children's future. All of it coalesced into a single truth. I was not an afterthought. I was the beginning. They clapped, hesitant at first, as though applause for this man had never occurred to them. Then the sound grew, filling the hall with a tide of respect long overdue. I stood slowly, the old jacket feeling both heavier and lighter. Heavier with emotion, lighter with vindication. And as the mayor closed the file and placed it gently on the podium, I realized that no gala program, no designer gown, no sparkling toast could ever rewrite this moment. The document they'd forgotten had reclaimed its place, inscribed not just in ink, but in the hearts of everyone who witnessed it. I allowed myself a single, unhurried step forward, and the distance between invisible donor and honored founder collapsed. In that step lived every stitch of my jacket, every act of unseen generosity, every memory woven into this story. And in the soft applause that followed, I knew the true foundation of their admiration was not the gala itself, but the man who dared to build it. I stepped back into the hall as the echoes of the mayor's words faded, and there was no applause, only the weight of 100 gazes pressed against the cavern of silence. It wasn't the polite quiet that follows a performance. It was the thunder of collective guilt, rolling through the room in low, hesitant rumbles, shaking every crystal chandelier until it trembled above our heads. Every pair of eyes found me, and suddenly my old jacket wasn't a relic. It was a testament. Its faded wool spoke louder than the polished speeches that had come before. It carried more truth than the gold leaf names on the programs. In that silence, the fabric itself seemed to glow, every fray and patch illuminated by the stark honesty now reflecting off every polished surface. I walked slowly, not because I hesitated, but because I wanted to feel each heartbeat of reckoning echo beneath my feet. The polished marble felt sacred now, as though the room itself had been consecrated by the discovery of its roots. Chairs lay abandoned, glasses half raised, as if the world had paused mid-breath to absorb the revelation. And me, wrapped in a jacket they once scorned, I felt a calm surge through my chest. It was the same jacket I'd worn to every building site, every scholarship ceremony, every trembling first step of a child toward education. But tonight, it carried more than memories. It carried the weight of justice. Faces that had once turned away now reflected shame. Hands that had clinked glasses in self-congratulation now hovered uncertainly in their laps. The symphony of guilt played a chord so deep it resonated in the bone. I understood then that silence could be a weapon too, one that revealed far more than any applause. I crossed the distance to the stage in measured steps, each one a reclamation. No one moved to stop me. No one dared speak. When I reached the podium, I placed my hand on the file the mayor had set down, and with that simple touch, I finished the sentence no brochure had written. Legacy isn't born in lights and laughter, but in the steadfast labor no one sees. The hush lingered, a mighty quiet that filled every corner of the hall, and in that space, I heard something more powerful than any toast, the beginning of something real. She emerged from the crowd like a timid shadow, her sequined gown brushing the floor, eyes cast downward, as though she were trying to vanish into the echo of her own regret. Amelia paused before me, lips quivering with words she couldn't quite form. Her shoulders shook, not with sobs, but with the weight of realization cracking through her carefully constructed composure. "I didn't know," she began, voice barely more than a whisper. Her confession hung between us, fragile and heavy, but before her plea could unfurl, I held up a hand, not in accusation, but in quiet redress. "You didn't ask," I said, each word measured as though carved from stone. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't point fingers. I just let those words fill the cavern of guilt she'd built around herself. In that charged moment, the gala's glittering lights dimmed to insignificance. There was no need for shame or public spectacle. The truth was its own reckoning. She lifted her eyes then, blue flecks trembling against so much unsaid, and I saw the little girl who once believed anything was possible. The girl who had traced her dreams in my palm, who'd once counted on me without ever knowing the cost. I stepped closer, the hem of her gown whispering against my worn shoes, and offered no reproach, only presence. The room held its breath as guests watched their princess of prestige stand stripped of pretense. No one moved, no one spoke. They waited as pride unraveled and sincerity wove itself back into the space she had emptied with silent ambition. Her gaze flickered to my jacket, its threadbare wool impossible to ignore now, not as fashion, but as testament. Each fray told of nights I stood guard over half-built walls. Each patch marked the defeats I turned into determination, and she saw in that fabric what she'd never allowed herself to see before, the unwavering heart beneath. Tears slipped down her cheeks, not for herself, but for the vision she'd lost sight of. And in the hush that followed, I realized forgiveness didn't need fanfare. It needed only a moment of shared vulnerability, a recognition that love and legacy endure beyond the facades we build. No one applauded. No cameras flashed. The room simply exhaled, releasing the tension that had coiled around every glass and every gilded centerpiece. Amelia reached out, her hand trembling as she brushed the sleeve of my jacket, an unspoken plea to reconnect with what mattered. And there, beneath the chandelier's softened glow, we both understood that some truths are too profound for speeches. In that quiet, her pride fell away, and something stronger took root. Humility. And as she looked up at me, not as gala host, but as the niece I'd once carried through muddy paths to school, I felt the full circle of our story closing. No program could script this reunion. No toast could honor it more deeply. Because sometimes the most powerful reconciliation happens not on stages or in brochures, but in the silent space where truth finally speaks. He stood first, small and steady, his uniform crisp despite the tremor in his hands. The young waiter whose life I'd helped change raised one hand and let it fall against his palm, the sound ringing out like a single earnest bell in the hushed hall. For a heartbeat, no one else moved. The only thing louder than his solitary clap was the pounding of my own heart, filled equal parts with gratitude and awe. Then another, an elderly board member who'd once scoffed at my ideas, lifted his hand and joined in, his slow, deliberate clap echoing across the marble floor. That simple act shattered the walls of pretense. Like droplets spreading ripples across a still pond, more hands came together. A banker who'd elbowed me aside, a socialite who'd turned her back, a reporter whose ink had never credited my work. One by one they rose from their seats, driven not by obligation or camera-ready theatrics, but by an undeniable pull of collective conscience. At last the entire room was on its feet, applause erupting in waves that carried sincerity rather than spectacle. They clapped not for silk gowns or gilded speeches, but for a man who had stood quietly in the corner, watching them celebrate his absence, and had chosen, instead, to show up anyway. In that chorus of respect, I felt the weight of every unnoticed sacrifice lift off my shoulders. The jacket I wore, threadbare, stained, and invaluable, felt lighter than air, as if each clap wove a new fiber of pride into its very seams. And in that standing ovation, free of fanfare and rich with genuine honor, I realized that true vindication doesn't arrive with grand declarations. It comes in the whispered ripple of realization, the sudden clarity that justice isn't given. It's earned piece by piece, stitch by stitch, until even the smallest voice can inspire a room to stand united. They guided me toward the back of the room for the closing photograph. Rows of suited donors and gala hosts aligned under the grand chandelier, ready to freeze this night in a glossy frame. A designer, draped in silk and confidence, offered me a new tuxedo on the spot, something befitting our honoree. Her voice held that familiar blend of courtesy and condescension, as if a wardrobe change could erase decades of worn toil. But I stood firm, feeling the texture of my jacket's wool beneath my fingertips. Every frayed edge whispered of early mornings hauling bricks, of late nights drafting proposals by lamplight, of quiet moments cradling scholarship letters that changed lives. I shook my head gently. "I wear who I am," I said, my voice soft but unwavering. For a heartbeat, the room held its breath. Mirrors and marble reflected more than faces. They reflected a man reclaiming his story. Then cameras clicked. Flashbulbs bloomed like sudden truths bursting in the dark. They captured me in that jacket. No borrowed elegance, no stitched-on pretense, just the honest fabric of my journey draped over shoulders that never turned away from hard work. Later, I learned they placed that very photograph at the heart of their new exhibit, the Legacy Room. There it hung, center stage among polished plaques and framed donor certificates. But unlike the nameless programs and gilded brochures, this image told the real story. A man who dressed not for acceptance, but for authenticity. In that room, visitors now pause before the photograph. They read the plaque beneath it. Roderick Wexley, founder and humble guardian of tomorrow's promise. And they see more than a man in an old jacket. They see every stitch of sacrifice, every thread of compassion woven into a legacy that no program could ever erase. And as the crowd moves on, I imagine those frames catching the light just right, illuminating not the shine of silk, but the strength of the human spirit. Because in the end, it wasn't about fitting in. It was about standing out for all the right reasons. When the last guest drifted away and the lights dimmed to their softest glow, I stood alone at the edge of the ballroom. No roar of applause, no flashing bulbs, just the quiet hum of air conditioning and the distant echo of laughter that once cut through me like a blade. In that hush, I realized something profound. I never craved the spotlight. My work was never about being seen. It was about building something that would outlast a single evening, a single speech, a single photograph. But tonight proved that silence, when unchallenged, can become the loudest form of consent. They laughed at my jacket not out of cruelty alone, but out of forgetfulness. They had forgotten what true legacy looks like. Not the gleam of fancy fabric, but the grit worn into every seam by hands that refuse to surrender. They had forgotten that a foundation is more than a name on a brochure. It's the countless unseen moments of sacrifice that hold up a dream. Now they remembered. In the hush of the empty hall, as the chandeliers cast long shadows across the polished floor, the memory of who I was and what I had built echoed louder than any scripted toast. That jacket, once scorned, had become a banner of authenticity. Each phrase spoke of nights spent under bare bulbs, drafting grant proposals. Each stain bore witness to the tears of children who dared to hope. Each faded hue marked the passage of time that never dimmed my conviction. I walked toward the exit, my steps steady and purposeful. Behind me, the velvet curtains gathered memories of their own. The way they had trembled when I first stood to be seen. The way they fell silent when truth was spoken. And the way they now hung heavy with respect for the quiet man who built this place. Reputation isn't worn, it's lived. It's the accumulation of every brick laid, every promise kept, every life uplifted when no one else was watching. And as I closed the door, leaving behind a room transformed not by glamour, but by genuine acknowledgement, I carried with me the knowledge that true honor doesn't arrive in designer cuts or gilded frames. It arrives in the lasting imprint of unseen deeds, woven stitch by stitch into the fabric of history.